Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along this morning to our presentation and workshop on information governance and data protection. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tree Hall. I'm the CEO of Charity IT Leaders, and we're an organisation that supports all charities and not-for-profits in getting the best from their technical estate, from maximising their impact through the use of technology. I am delighted to be working alongside Smartdesc, one of our fantastic gold sponsors, on today's workshop. I'm so pleased that they're doing this because of all the partners that we have, and we've got a lot of great sponsors. I think Smartdesk are just such experts in this area that they will be able to give you the very best insight into information governance, how to protect your organisation, how to hit all of those data protection legislations, but also how to make those things work in your organisation, because it's not as straightforward as just following a prescribed list. You have to think about how you're going to apply it to your organisation. So without further ado, because you're not here to listen to me speak, I'm going to hand over to our two presenters, Andrew and Ricky from Smartdesc, who will take you through, as I say, first part presentation, which will be recorded, and then we'll move on after a short break to the Q&A, which will be very much interactive. You are welcome to post questions in the Q&A part of Teams throughout the first part of the workshop if you would like to. If you want to hold them until the end session, until the actual Q&A session, and ask them live, that's also absolutely fine. But please do keep your questions coming, because the more things you ask, the more information you will get from this morning. So thank you very much. That's enough from me. Andrew, Ricky, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tree, and yeah, thanks for the very kind words there. So hi all, I'm Andrew Coyle, the Information Security Director at Smartdesc. So I've been working with Smartdesc for about 6.5 years now, and I've been working in IT, data protection and information security with charities for about the last 12 years. So thanks all for joining us this morning, and I'll pass you over to my colleague Ricky to introduce himself and get started.
Thanks, Andrew, and welcome everyone to this morning's session. My name's Ricky Wilding, and I'm the Information Governance Manager at Smartdesc. I've been working in information governance for almost 10 years. All of my experience, is with the non-profit sector. So hopefully you find something really useful in this presentation this morning. So before we go into the presentation itself, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about Smartdesc. So our sole focus is working with charities and other non-profits. And as a company, we support over 50 charities, 15 of which we support with their information governance program specifically. Some of the charities that we work with include Refugee Action, Terence Higgins Trust, Pancreatic Cancer UK, Prostate Cancer UK, and some of the others that you see here, such as Stonewall. Now, to give you a bit of an overlook on the agenda for today, the first thing we're going to look at, we're going to have a brief look at a few of the incidents that have happened over the last few years and how they've affected the non-profit sector. After that, I'm going to introduce you to a fictional charity called the Hopeful Health Trust and an incident scenario that they were involved in. We're going to look into a breach that occurred at the trust and the impact that it had on them. And then from there, we're going to explore some ways in which the impact on the charity could have been reduced, as well as some tips on how to implement an effective information governance framework. And then lastly, we're going to take a quick 5-minute comfort break, and then we're going to come back to a Q&A where we'll answer some questions from you. So I'm going to pass you back over to Andrew, who's going to kindly talk through some of the incidents that have been happening over the last couple of years.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ricky. So this slide is really just to give a bit of context before we move into the fictional data breach scenario. So in general, there's been a change in the landscape over the past few years, with more organisations falling victim to data breaches. This has resulted in more of an awareness that there's a significant risk to all organisations. And we've seen this reflected in information security and data protection risk being more prominent in organisations' corporate risk registers. So charities have unfortunately been targeted by criminals, as they've sometimes been seen as a bit of a softer touch. But that being said, most of the breaches that we've seen tend to come from indiscriminate attacks. So ultimately, attackers are opportunistic and will attack any organisation if they think they can make money from doing so. So some of the headlines on the right-hand side here show examples of data breaches that have affected charities. So with SAMH, I believe it was a ransomware attack where personal information, including passport scans, were breached. And with Mermaids, they had insufficient security settings, resulting in a large amount of email data that was compromised. And the final headline here is a bit of a scary one, with a quarter of charities experiencing an attack in the last year. And I think that the Civil Society also released a similar figure, saying that 24% of charities have experienced an attack. So unfortunately, these types of incidents do happen, and they can have a huge impact on a charity's reputation as well as a significant operational impact. So Mermaids were fined, I think it was £25,000 by the ICO. The ICO obviously have the power to enforce monetary penalties where an organisation hasn't taken the right precautions, and they decided to do so in this instance. But there would have also been significant operational costs incurred as well. So the upcoming slides are really here to hopefully give you an idea of what can be done to reduce the impact should the worst case scenario happen. And we'll take a look at how the data protection principles really play a key part in reducing the risk to organisations and individuals should they be caught up in a data breach. So I'll pass you back over to Ricky now to move into the scenario.
Thanks, Andrew. So next, what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce you to the Hopeful Health Trust. They're a fictional charity, and this instance scenario is obviously fictional as well. But we're going to take a brief look at what they do as a charity, and then after that, we're going to hop right into the incident scenario. So the Hopeful Health Trust are a charity that provides several services to individuals affected by various physical and mental health conditions. They provide services such as one-to-one support via telephone and web chat. They provide assistance with access to services and benefits where individuals have specific health conditions. They host a community forum that allow individuals to directly communicate with each other to provide support. And they also carry out several sort of fundraising activities and host events for individuals to take part in. Now, for the charity to be able to provide these services, they collect a lot of personal information from individuals, and this includes information about their finances, and that's where they try to access specific benefits or services. And they also collect special category data about their health. Now, the work that this charity do is very complex and has a lot of moving parts, as I'm sure you can understand from the various services that they provide. And some of this work requires sharing information between teams to understand an individual's specific needs, as well as sharing this information with third-party organisations to provide those services. Now we're going to have a quick look at the breach that happened. And it will be sort of your typical scenario that we've tried to lay out here. So one day, a member of staff was working through their busy mailbox as usual, and clicked on a link within an email that demanded their urgent attention. So that typical spam sort of email that requires looks like it requires your urgent attention and demands that you act quickly. Now, unfortunately for the trust, upon clicking the link that they found that the information on the shared network was being encrypted and that they were the victim of a ransomware attack. Now, most of the information on the shared drive became inaccessible unless the Hopeful Health Trust paid a ransom fee to unlock the information. Now, as I'm sure you're probably thinking, there was a bit of chaos ensued. They were trying to, get things together and understand the sort of the spread of the incident. But after a very brief investigation, the trust reported the incident to the ICO, as the information that was compromised included information that was really sensitive. Now, typically, when the Information Commissioner's Office get involved or investigate a breach, they find that the actual breach itself is just the tip of the iceberg. And following a lengthy ICO investigation, they found that whilst the breach was really unfortunate, the trust hadn't taken the necessary steps to ensure that personal data had been processed in accordance with the principles of the UK GDPR. And because those findings were so significant, the ICO issued a monetary penalty of £25,000, but noted in their enforcement notice that the fine could have been significantly reduced or even avoided if the Hopeful Health Trust had done more to comply with data protection legislation. Now, in this next slide, I just wanted to take a look at what some of those ICO findings were and sort of explain some of the impact and sort of show you some of the impacts that this had on the charity. So in the enforcement notice issued by the ICO, they documented the following findings. so that they found that there were insufficient processes in place to manage personal data in line with the principles of the UK GDPR, which likely means that personal data was being processed inconsistently and the principles of the UK GDPR hadn't properly been considered. Data protection training had not been provided to staff, and there was a lack of awareness around email security. Personal data had been duplicated and stored in multiple areas of the estate. Thousands of ID documents have been found in various locations, only some of which were stored on the database, which should have been their usual their actual process. And due to lack of processes and procedures, personal information had been duplicated on the database and shared network. So personal information was also being retained within emails in Outlook, which weren't being deleted when they were no longer needed. So we had information in all different locations. It was all being duplicated, which really increased the risk of that data being compromised. Personal data was being retained about individuals that they were no longer working with or supporting. There were no data protection impact assessments for various high-risk processing activities that were taking place at the trust. Procedures for processing ID documentation hadn't been documented, and this meant that it was being collected, but it wasn't always clear why. And some teams were collecting the information because they thought it might be useful. And finally, there was a lack of technical security to reduce the likelihood of a cyber attack. So some of the technical teams hadn't done enough to protect the organization from an attack like this. So we've had a really quick look at what the incident was, how that affected the charity, and what the ICO's investigation actually shown the charity. Now, in this next part of the presentation, I want to look at how we would reduce that impact and what the Hopeful Health Trust could have done to sort of reduce the risk and what they would have done with those ICO findings following the investigation. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how you would implement an information governance framework and following the principles of the UK GDPR and how that can significantly reduce the impact of an incident like this. So I think it's safe to say that whilst the Hopeful Health Trust have very good intentions to support those in need, it's likely that they hadn't really considered how they would comply with data protection legislation, which would have helped protect the people that they're working with, which I think would have been their ultimate goal. Now, information governance is a really complex and difficult area to navigate sometimes, and it's even more difficult to understand where an organisation should start when it comes to complying with data protection legislation. So with this slide here, what I'd like to do is look at some of the 3 steps that you could take initially to really sort of build on that framework, or at least get that framework started. So the first step is to introduce an information governance structure within the charity. This shows that there's responsibility for implementing the information governance framework. Now, some organisations may have a data protection officer in place who really is the point of contact for staff who have questions about data protection compliance, and they will work with the ICO when required. So, for example, if there's been a complaint by an individual or if there's been a data breach, they'll work with the ICO directly to resolve that. DPO may also be the point of contact for members of the public who've raised concerns or maybe have requested to invoke one of their rights, such as the right of access. And some of the charities that we work with specifically have even introduced an internal forum for different departments to attend, where they will discuss data protection issues or upcoming projects, which can help bring more attention to this subject and make the organisation much more proactive. The next thing that you'd really need to do is raise awareness. So all staff must receive regular data protection training, and this needs to be delivered on an annual basis to ensure that staff are aware of their responsibilities. And this training should be updated regularly to capture changes to regulatory guidance, best practice, as well as changes to the legislation, and even changes to internal process and procedure. And lastly, in the start or your build up to an information governance framework, you should look at the visibility. And what we mean by this is that an organisation can only understand how to protect the personal data they're working with if they actually know what it is they're processing. So for full visibility on the personal data being processed, we recommend you carry out a data mapping exercise. And this will help you understand some of the following. And what we've done here is try to make sort of a who, what, where, why, and when of things that you should consider in this data mapping exercise. So the who might be the team processing the data and who they're sharing it with. The what might be, what data are they processing? The where would be, where is the data coming from and where is it being stored? Why are the team processing that data? So think about the things like your legal basis. So for example, are you relying on consent? Have you got a legitimate interest to process that data? Or have you got a legal obligation to do something? And the when would be, when do you need to delete or destroy that data? So looking more at training in a bit more, looking at training a bit more specifically, training is an essential component to comply with data protection legislation. It really helps underpin what the expectations of the organisation are and gives staff the knowledge necessary to process personal data appropriately. Now, for the trust specifically, this would have given them key information on how to comply with the following 4 principles. So knowledge surrounding the data minimization principle would have shown staff that the only necessary personal data should have been collected. It shouldn't have been duplicated and stored in multiple areas where it's likely to be unaccounted for. Training around storage limitation would have prompted staff to delete any personal information that was no longer necessary. So where they're working where they're no longer working with individuals, they should have been prompted to delete that data at that point. Email security awareness may have made staff more diligent when receiving emails and shown them how to identify any potential scams or harmful links within those emails. And by explaining accountability or the accountability principle to staff, they may have been more aware of the importance of data protection impact assessments and having robust sort of processes and procedures within their teams. Now, obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list on what training should cover, but some of these learning topics could have significantly reduced the impact of the breach on the Hopeful Health Trust and given staff the information they needed to be able to follow their own internal processes appropriately. Now, I did sort of cover data mapping in the last couple of slides, but I just wanted to sort of go into a bit more detail about why it's so important. And data mapping is a really important aspect of data protection compliance, as it really provides that vivid picture on the life cycle of the data being processed. This exercise will also help identify where personal data is being duplicated within the organisation. Andrew and I, we often see that spreadsheets and documents containing personal data are downloaded from the shared drive or they're exported from a database, and they can just sit dormant in various areas of the estate for really long periods of time. Which really does increase the impact of a data breach, where if the information is easily accessible and it doesn't need to be, information should only really be in the one place it needs to be. So the data mapping exercise will also highlight personal data that is likely to be of a higher risk and help prompt the completion of a data protection impact assessment. And you can determine higher risk usually by the different types of data that you're processing. So for example, are you processing any special category data? And information relating to health, in the case of the trust, that would have been a higher risk to them. Or are you processing information that could be used to cause any sort of harm? So when we talk about harm, we're really talking about financial harm, emotional harm, or physical harm. And if any of those 3 sort of terms can be met, then it's likely that the risk is going to be higher. Now, you might be wondering, where do we start with a data mapping exercise? How do we even know what to put into this, or where do we even begin? Now, the ICO do have a data mapping template, which does contain some really useful examples that almost any organisation can use. And what we'll do shortly after this presentation is include a link to that document so that you can have a look at that if you haven't already got this in place. Now, the data minimization principle makes it really clear that organizations should only process personal data that is necessary for the specific purposes that have already been explained to an individual, and that processes and procedures need to be in place to ensure that this is followed consistently. So some of the things that the Hopeful Health Trust needed to consider are, did they need to request full ID documentation, or could they have requested specific information from those documents? Alternatively, did they even need to collect ID documentation? Would it have been more appropriate to confirm information and then delete the document? So if they did need to collect it, if once they received that document, did they only need to take down the information that was necessary and delete it, or did they actually need to store it? And these are things that are really important to consider. It's important to remember that information or personal information should never be collected just in case it might serve a purpose in the future. We frequently see that organizations will collect personal data just because they might need it or it might serve a useful purpose. And it's an easy trap to fall in, but always remember that if it's not immediately necessary, don't collect it. You know, if you need to collect more information in the future, there's nothing stopping you from communicating with that individual and asking them for additional information. That's a much safer alternative than collecting more than you need. Now, retention was a really key issue that was identified at the Hope for Health Trust because they weren't deleting data that was no longer necessary. So personal data about individuals they were no longer providing services to was being retained, and there was no justification for that. So here it's important to remember that whilst all personal data must have a life cycle, if you have got a reasonable justification to retain personal data outside of that, then you can retain it. However, it's really important that the justification to retain personal data is documented alongside a date for review so that you don't then keep that data indefinitely. So if you need to keep data, that's okay. Make sure you document your justification for doing so. However, if there is no good justification, then you should delete it. Now, I'm well aware that retention is quite easy to talk about, and and it's easy for me to say how long, what you should do with regard to retention, but it's actually quite difficult to put into practice. Now, one of the tips from me is that the data mapping exercise will give a full picture on what personal data you're processing. And it's also a really good head start for the retention schedule, which is necessary so the staff understand when personal data should be deleted. So once you've done that data mapping exercise, you can then look at what data you have and then look at how long you should be keeping that for, and then almost duplicate some of that into a proper retention schedule. Now, the retention schedule, and data mapping document will also help the charity identify where they should search for information in the event that an individual submits a subject access or erasure request. We see it quite often that organisations will just search the 3 key systems for information, but actually don't have the full picture. They won't go searching in all of the real necessary places where there might be a document sitting, or something that the actual that has been requested by the individual. And in the instance scenario we looked at, if the trust had deleted the data that was outside of their retention schedule, then they would have reduced some of that impact. The cyber criminals wouldn't have had access to information that the charity didn't even need anymore. So they increased the risk by retaining it. Now I'm going to pass back over to Andrew, who's going to talk through the security principle and some of the things that could be done to help prevent a cyber attack, or at least things that you should be considering when you're doing when you're building your information governance framework.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. And as Ricky mentioned, security is one of the data protection principles and can be a really key component in the worst case scenario where there is a data breach. So it's a whole topic on its own, really. So we're not going to go into too much detail here, but just a few areas to consider. Firstly, Ricky already mentioned the importance of your data mapping exercise. And running through this should really help you to determine what the most critical information assets are that you want to secure. So we call this kind of finding your crown jewels, and really knowing this information should help you to risk assess your assets and really focus your attention on the most critical areas. We also recommend following a framework. We think that's a good idea. There tends to be suitable frameworks for organisations no matter where you are in your journey. So Cyber Essentials tends to be a good place to start. There's also the NCSE 10 steps to cybersecurity and also ISO 27001 if you're a little bit further on in your journey. So for most organisations, being good at the kind of security fundamentals is what's really important, as it makes you a less attractive organisation to attack. So this matters because attackers are often trying to make money in as short a time as possible. So if they see that you've got good security fundamentals in place, they might just move on to an easier target. So fundamentals are things like patching, having MFA enforced, only using your administrator accounts where and when they're absolutely needed, and also making sure that access to information is only available on a need-to-know basis. And the NCSE have some really good resources around security for charities, which I'd highly recommend checking out. So yeah, I'll pass you back over to Ricky now to talk about accountability.
Thanks, Andrew. So accountability under the UK GDPR means that organisations not only have to put into place the other 6 principles, but they have to be able to evidence how they comply with them. Now, one of the key aspects of a key part of accountability is completing data protection impact assessments. And through documenting a data processing activity using this process, the organisation will have a much better insight into how the personal data is being processed and how it can be protected. Now, the DPO process will present questions about about each of the principles and ask how you will comply with them. And a thorough assessment will clearly identify risks in the processing and prompt you to either put in place mitigations to either reduce or eliminate those risks. It will also help the organisation identify where additional processes or procedures need to be in place to facilitate that processing. Now, the DPIA is significant, as in the event of a data breach investigation, the ICO are likely to ask if a DPIA had been completed for the specific processing activity, or for the platform that was breached, or for anything surrounding that sort of processing. So for this reason, it's essential that as much detail is provided as possible within the document, and that you document the DPIA as if you're addressing an external audience. Now, data protection impact assessments aren't the only way organisations can show their accountability. There are dozens of different ways that we can do this, and some of that might include having training records, having policies, processes and procedures, as well as data breach and individual rights request logs. And there are other ways that we can show there are other ways that organisations can comply with the accountability principle. And it's really important that everything you do is well documented, so that in the event of an investigation by the ICO, you can show how you got to the decisions that you made. So you're probably thinking, well, would this really have impacted the outcome? And unfortunately, any organisation can be a victim of cybercrime. You know, we can't guarantee that. There's never a 100% guarantee that you'll never be the victim of a cyber attack, because cyber criminals are always looking for new vulnerabilities to infiltrate the most sophisticated systems. And even though we can't always prevent a cyber attack, by taking the steps that we've covered in the previous slides in this presentation, you can significantly reduce the impact of a data breach by taking that proactive approach to data protection compliance. And being proactive may have resulted in a lesser penalty, or even no penalty at all, and maybe just an enforcement notice, just providing some actions for the charity to take to prevent this from happening in the future. Now, before we move on, I just wanted to provide some information around some essential components around information governance, and really sort of, help you on your way to building that information governance framework. So the things that we've listed here are: make sure that you set out the information governance structure internally. There needs to be a way for people to ask questions, or staff to ask questions, and there needs to be a central point of contact who's going to be dealing with this work, essentially. We'd always recommend carrying out an internal data protection audit to find out what is working well and perhaps not so well, and then create a list of actions to get yourself on the right track. So things that you can work towards to being a better organisation at data protection. It's essential to ensure that all staff have received data protection training. This is a key step in making sure that everybody is on the right page and everybody's doing the same thing. Next, we'd recommend you complete that data mapping exercise. That way you'll understand what personal data you're processing and know what your risks might be. You must have a set of internal policies and procedures for processing personal data. That way everybody's doing the same thing consistently, and you've got something that you can rely on to say, this is how we should be working. You need to make sure that you've got privacy notices and that they're provided to individuals at every point of data collection. That way we set out the reasonable expectation of individuals so that they know how we're going to process their personal data. We need to document the process for actioning individual rights, such as subject access and erasure requests, what that journey looks like internally, and how we communicate with the individual and how we present them with the information that they've requested. And data protection impact assessments must be completed for all areas of high risk processing. And if you're not sure if it's a high risk, then you should probably complete one anyway. That way you've covered your back in case of an investigation, or you're not really sure how a certain process is going to work. Now, where organisations don't have the in-house expertise, we can help them by providing one or more of the sort of following services. So when we're working with some of our customers, we work with them to audit the departments across the organisation. We document our findings in plain English and provide a roadmap of actions for the organisations to carry out, which will help them develop their data protection programme. We also provide training to help our customers understand what data protection means to them and how they can navigate some of the more complex or confusing areas of work. We try to break down confusing terms and explain them clearly, and then we try to reinforce those topics through interactive quizzes throughout the sort of session, and we play games and things like that to really help drive that knowledge forward. And in a lot of the cases, we support organisations in following up actions that were found in the audit and advise staff on day-to-day data protection matters by acting as a central point of contact for that subject. Just to note as well, we're going to be providing some free one-to-one consultations on information governance, the UK GDPR and data protection for non-profits in the near future. So, keep your ears to the ground for that. We'll be issuing some communication about that very shortly. Now I think we're going to take a short 5-minute break, and then what we'll do is we'll come back and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A. So if you've got any questions, please submit them to the Q&A,